What if the strangest part wasn't the giant standing in the photograph, it was the caption underneath it that told you exactly how not to believe what you were seeing? It started with a photograph. That always does, doesn't it? I was 3 hours deep inside a digitized archive of 19th century circus promotional materials, the kind of rabbit hole you tumble into when you're supposed to be doing something else entirely. And that's when I found it. A sepia-toned cabinet card, circa 1880, from a traveling American exhibition. Two men in top hats stand chest level to a third figure. The third figure is not standing on a platform. There is no forced perspective I can identify with any confidence, no hidden box beneath his feet, no camera angle that would neatly explain away the proportions. He is simply large, enormously, unsettlingly large. The caption read, "The celebrated giant, a marvel of nature or the finest deception in showmanship." I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, why are those the only two options? Why, in the framing of that era itself, was the dominant cultural script for encountering an extraordinarily large human being either a wonder of nature or an elaborate trick? And why was the hoax explanation so aggressively preloaded into the presentation, almost as if someone needed the audience to choose it? That question lodged inside me like a splinter, and the deeper I went into the archive, the further that splinter worked its way in. What I found was not a single curiosity, it was a pattern, a repeating, cross-continental, suspiciously well-coordinated pattern, and once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. We are told, and we largely accept without scrutiny, that the 19th century circus was a celebration of the exotic, the unusual, and the theatrical. P.T. Barnum's famous line, "There's a sucker born every minute," has been so thoroughly absorbed into our cultural memory that we use it as a lens through which we interpret the entire era. It was a period of showmanship, of deception, of willing suspension of disbelief. That framing is useful, perhaps too useful, because here is what it accomplishes. It creates a totalizing interpretive framework in which anything encountered within the context of a circus exhibition is, by definition, suspect, staged, performative, the product of padding, stilts, camera tricks, and the credulity of crowds. The circus was the era's designated space of acceptable unreality, and anything placed inside that space, any body, any claim, any apparently anomalous human form, gets automatically processed through that framework, not examined, not independently documented with any methodological rigor, simply labeled, exhibited, and then, when the tour ended, quietly packed away. This raises a simple but critical question. If you needed to display something real, something whose reality was inconvenient, whose existence disrupted a particular narrative about what humanity was and had recently been, where would you put it? Where would you place it so that curious eyes could see it, so that complete suppression became unnecessary, but so that its implications could be safely neutralized? You would put it in the circus. You would call it a wonder or a hoax and let the crowd decide. And the crowd, primed by decades of Barnum-esque showmanship, would choose the hoax almost every single time. Now let's talk about the giants themselves, not the legend, not the mythology, the documented, advertised, ticketed, and toured individuals who appeared under circus and traveling exhibition banners across North America and Europe from roughly the 1850s through the 1910s. The names alone are worth pausing on. Colonel Ralph Gann, the Arabian Giant, Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, the Kentucky Giant, Angus McCaskill, the Cape Breton Giant, Chang Yu Sing, the Chinese Giant, Edouard Beaupré, the Willow Bunch Giant, Ella Ewing, the Missouri Giantess, and dozens more from Sweden, from Russia, from the Ottoman territories, from Brazil, from the African continent.
The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every continent that had, within living memory, undergone some form of the great civilizational disruption that certain researchers associate with a far older global order, across every region where old maps, old structures, old infrastructure of contested origin still stands in some form, in every place where the bones of the earth still seem to carry the architectural memory of something that came before the world we were told had always been. All of them appear fully formed in the exhibition record. Almost none of them have robust documentation of their earlier lives. Orphaned histories, vague origins, geographic attributions that shift between promotional materials, Arabian, Kentucky, Chinese, labels of convenience, not biography. And here is the strangest part. When you try to trace their lineages backward, to find the family records, the birth documents, the parish registers, the census notations that should, in the increasingly bureaucratic 19th century, exist in abundance, the trail goes thin, very thin. In some cases, it effectively vanishes. Why? I want to be careful here. I am not a biologist. I am not a physician. I am not going to make definitive claims about what human physiology can and cannot produce. But I am going to note something the evidence appears to suggest, and I'm going to ask you to sit with it. The officially recorded heights of the so-called circus giants cluster in a remarkably narrow band: 7 feet 8, 7 feet 9, 8 feet 2. The most famous cases hover just below or around the 8-foot threshold, with a small number of outliers pushing beyond it. This is presented as the natural upper ceiling of extraordinary human variation, framed by the medical literature of the era as pathological giantism, acromegaly, pituitary abnormality. The circus framing reinforced this. Here was a body produced by malfunction, by excess, by nature gone wrong. But consider the skeletal record, not the circus record, the skeletal record. Reports of excavated remains appeared throughout the 19th century in newspaper accounts from across the continental United States, from Ireland, from Turkey, from Peru, from the islands of the Pacific, describing bones of apparently human morphology at dimensions that exceed the circus-era figures: 9 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, in the most extreme accounts. These reports are almost universally dismissed today on the grounds that they appeared in newspapers, and 19th century newspapers were sensationalist, unreliable, and editorially undisciplined. But the official explanation collapses right there on that single point alone, because the same newspapers deemed too unreliable to transmit accurate skeletal measurements are considered entirely reliable when they document elections, legal proceedings, business transactions, and the statements of presidents. We trust them selectively. We trust them when their testimony confirms the world we expect, and we dismiss them when their testimony unsettles it. Ask yourself why. Here is where we arrive at something I find genuinely impossible to ignore, no matter how many times I approach it from a skeptical angle. The campaign to frame large human individuals as performers, as entertainments, as pathologies, as hoaxes or marvels was not an American phenomenon. It was not a British phenomenon. It was not even a Western phenomenon. It was global, simultaneous, and extraordinarily well coordinated for a world that had no telecommunications. In the 1860s and 1870s, while Barnum's exhibitions were establishing the interpretive template in the northeastern United States, traveling exhibitions with strikingly similar framing were operating in France, in the German states, in the Russian Empire, in the Ottoman capital, in Kolkata, in Shanghai, in Cape Town, and across the cities of South America. Different languages, different promotional traditions, different cultural contexts for spectacle and wonder, and yet the same essential message reproduced across all of them. This large person is either a natural aberration or an elaborate deception. Choose one, move along. Not an organized movement, not a conspiracy with named architects, not a coordinated campaign with a paper trail. A cultural convergence so uniform, so simultaneous, so consistent in its core logic that it demands an explanation. Think carefully about what global coordination in the 19th century actually required. You needed transportation networks, communication infrastructure, institutions, press organizations, scientific societies, governmental bodies willing to adopt and amplify a consistent framework. And you needed all of that to happen organically and spontaneously across cultures that were simultaneously engaged in massive geopolitical conflict with one another. Does that seem more plausible to you than the alternative? That there was something, not a conspiracy, but a shared institutional interest, a shared epistemological need in making certain kinds of bodies legible only as entertainment.
I want to approach this carefully because this is where the territory becomes most contested and where intellectual rigor matters most. There is a growing body of researchers working outside academic institutions, largely self-funded, largely dismissed, who propose that the civilization appearing on European maps under the name Tartaria, with striking geographic prominence from the 16th through the early 19th centuries before abruptly vanishing from cartographic and historical consciousness, was not simply a geographic designation for the steppe regions of Central Asia. They propose, with varying degrees of evidence and varying degrees of interpretive restraint, that it was the remnant of something older, a civilization of different scale, different proportion, whose physical infrastructure, the wide corridors, the grand arches, the enormous doorways, the strikingly high ceilings of buildings we are now told were constructed by relatively recent populations for entirely conventional purposes, was built for bodies that were not the same as ours. I am not going to tell you this is true. I am going to ask you to look at what they've assembled and ask yourself whether the official explanation that all of those doors and ceilings and arches were simply aesthetic choices, expressions of ambition, monuments to ego, fully satisfies you. And I am going to ask you to hold that question alongside the circus record. Because here is what the evidence appears to suggest when you lay them next to each other. In the same decades during which the last remnants of the old architectural world were being demolished, remodeled, or absorbed into new institutional use, roughly 1820 through 1910, a wave of unusually large human individuals appeared in the public record, were immediately absorbed into the entertainment infrastructure, and were systematically framed as either pathological or theatrical. Not political refugees, not living representatives of a displaced people, not the physical inheritors of a different era of human history, freaks or fakes. This is the part that quiets the room. Several of the documented circus giants died in institutional or exhibition custody, and their remains were retained, not returned to families, not interred with the dignity extended to ordinary citizens, retained. Edouard Beaupré, the Willow Bunch giant, died in 1904. His body was displayed in a traveling exhibition for years after his death. It was eventually acquired by a university, where it remained as a specimen for decades. His family's requests for the return of his remains for proper burial were not honored for the better part of a century. A university held a dead man's body, a man of unusual physical proportions, as a scientific specimen for a century. I want to ask you directly, what were they studying? What question did his body answer that required continuous possession? What was it about his physical form that made institutional retention preferable to burial?
The silence surrounding these questions is not the silence of incomplete record-keeping. It is a specific, shaped silence, the kind that forms around something certain institutions have collectively decided not to discuss. Once you sense it, that silence becomes its own kind of evidence. Before photography was standardized, before studio conventions became rigidly established, a window existed, roughly 1845 to 1875, during which photographic subjects were captured with relative consistency of scale. The technology was new enough that systematic distortion for commercial purposes had not yet become standard practice. The conventions of trick photography were being invented in real time, and their signatures are, to a trained eye, often detectable. In this window, the photographic record of large human individuals is striking. There are images, I have spent considerable time with them, in which the proportional relationships between subjects are not easily explained by any combination of perspective, platform, footwear, or lens distortion I have been able to identify. Images where the geometry simply resists the hoax interpretation. Not in every case, not uniformly, but in enough cases, with enough regularity, that the question will not resolve cleanly. And in almost every case, these images were produced for or acquired by circus promotion, which means they enter the archive already pre-labeled, already interpreted for us. The caption tells us how to see, and we see accordingly. What would we find, I wonder, if we stripped the captions away, if we looked at the photographs, as light striking a sensitized surface and recording what was there, rather than as circus ephemera? If we asked, not is this trick convincing, but what would have to be true for this not to be a trick? The circus giant, as a sustained, prominent, repeating exhibition phenomenon, essentially vanishes in the first decades of the 20th century. Not immediately, not all at once, but with a rapidity that is worth noting. The early 1900s bring new institutional frameworks, the modern research hospital, the newly professionalized discipline of anthropology, the consolidating authority of national museums and scientific societies. The unusual human body is gradually transferred out of the exhibition economy and into the scientific one. The circus freak gives way to the medical case study, and in that transition, something closes. The medical case study is a controlled genre. It circulates within professional networks, behind the paywalls of academic journals, within the institutional walls of teaching hospitals. It is not public. It is not available for independent examination. It is interpreted by credentialed professionals and reported in terms the layperson is expected to accept on authority. Was this a natural evolution of scientific practice? Perhaps, probably yes, in many respects. But notice what it accomplished. It moved the anomalous body from the public gaze to the professional gaze. It replaced the ambiguity of the circus, hoax, or wonder with the closed certainty of the diagnosis: pituitary dysfunction, endocrine abnormality, case closed. The photographs went into private collections, the skeletal remains went into storage, the promotional materials were acquired by specialist archives with limited public access, and the people themselves, the living memory of what they had been, of where they had come from, of whether they had stories about their origins that did not match the promotional labels, were gone. Not hidden, not suppressed, simply allowed to become unreachable. I began this investigation as a skeptic. I remain skeptical of easy answers, of tidy narratives, of the temptation to replace one closed explanatory system with another. But I no longer find the official account sufficient. The official account that the circus giants were a mixture of genuinely tall individuals with medical conditions and elaborate theatrical hoaxes all of it absorbed into the entertainment culture of a credulous era, does not account for the consistency of the framing across cultures with no mechanism for coordination. It does not account for the thinning of biographical records at precisely the point where they should be thickest. It does not account for the institutional retention of physical remains or the migration of anomalous bodies from public exhibition to closed professional custody at exactly the moment that the old world's architecture was being most aggressively demolished and reclassified. And it does not account for the most striking fact of all, that the people described in the promotional literature of their own era as the most extraordinary human specimens alive, individuals whose existence, taken face value, would demand a profound revision of our understanding of recent human history, were systematically placed inside a context designed to make them unbelievable. Not executed, not imprisoned, not simply hidden, made unbelievable. There is a particular kind of erasure that requires no destruction. It requires only recontextualization. Place the evidence where it will be seen, but frame it so that no one will credit what they're seeing. The circus, in this reading, was not a celebration of the strange, it was a managed disclosure. A space where the otherwise unmanageable could be safely contained within the category of entertainment. And here is the question I keep returning to, the one that won't release me at 3 in the morning when the archive is open and the photographs are spread across my screen. If these individuals were simply tall people with medical conditions, if their proportions were pathological, their heights explicable, their bodies entirely consistent with the world we understand it, why did the institutions of the era work so hard to ensure we would never quite believe them? What exactly were we being protected from believing? The evidence doesn't answer that question, not fully, not yet. But the question